happen at any time, at any place in the developed world. You're driving home from work, you're walking the city streets, or just relaxing in your apartment or suburban home. We've all seen the movies. There's a piercing sound from your cell phone, a tone you've only heard when there's an Amber Alert. Ballistic missile threat inbound. Seek shelter immediately. For a second, you think, this must be a joke or a mistake. It's happened before, after all. But then there's another sound, an air raid siren that cuts through the ambient city cacophony and suburban silence. This is real. Your heart sinks into your gut as a volatile mixture of fear, panic, and disbelief overtakes you. Take shelter? How? Where? There's no escape from a nuclear bomb, right? The city streets are flooded with panicked people seeking shelter, trampling each other with reckless abandon, screaming, crying, and cursing. Some are totally overcome with fear so that they can do nothing but shamble in a fugue state. The scene is interrupted bluntly by a terrific flash of light. Those unlucky enough to stare at it are rendered temporarily blind. All else scatter like roaches into whatever hole they can find. You take cover with your family, waiting for the inevitable. And then it happens. Every living thing close to the epicenter is utterly vaporized by thermal radiation hotter than the surface of the sun. The heat sweeps over the cities and suburbs, engulfing the whole area in flames. And shortly after that, you finally hear the explosion. A loud crack, followed by a sweeping blast wave. Hurricane-force winds scatter debris across the city, and the overpressure sunders weaker buildings and shatters windows. The destruction is completed by firestorm, with every flammable material in the cities and suburbs consumed by flames that melt iron. You emerge from your shelter, surviving by some miracle, but everyone already knows what happens next. The sun is gone, and a fine rain of dust and ash is beginning to fall from the sky. Is this the end of the world? Everyone knows about nuclear weapons. Ever since the advent of atomic bombs, there has always been a section of culture and media obsessed with the hideously destructive power of nukes. The Terminator series uses the idea of nuclear apocalypse as a backdrop to an action movie, and the Fallout video game series is inseparably married to the idea of nuclear war and its effects. Countless fictional stories rest on the surety of absolute destruction in the wake of full-scale atomic warfare. Everybody knows it would happen, too. No one has to be convinced that the world would end. We all go about our daily lives knowing full well that if Russia, China, or the United States decided to fight each other to the death, it would literally end the world. But how many of us actually choose to ponder exactly how such events might go? Why are nuclear weapons so threatening to our very existence? What is nuclear winter, and how would it come about? What would happen if a nuclear bomb detonated over your city or town? Well, this video is part one of a 4-part series that seeks to answer those questions, starting with the biggest one of all. Could the world survive a nuclear war? To that end, my analysis will be from a broad perspective, both historically and practically. If you want the nitty-gritty details, like what would happen if a nuke literally fell on you, I'll be going over those in parts 2, 3, and 4. For now, I will limit my discussion to broad-stroke theories on what would happen to the world and the societies in it if global thermonuclear war took place today. Way back in 1914, more than 30 years before nuclear weapons existed at all, author H.G. Wells wrote a book called The World Set Free. In this story, mankind's discovery of atomic energy is characterized as an inevitable technological step in the march toward utopia. But before man could reach his Wellsian paradise, he'd have to endure one final trial: nuclear war. To be sure, Wells's nuke is almost nothing like the bombs that would appear in the mid-century, but the author knew that whatever weapon was created, it would threaten the world order in a profound way. Wells contended that atomic weapons would help finally prove the futility of war and usher in a new era of peace and prosperity. All mankind would have to do to get to that paradise is survive. Wells was not the only person to consider the terrible power of nuclear weapons in the early 20th century. His fictional account was not quite apocalyptic, and some folks would probably consider the author to be pretty optimistic about the end of it all. One of Wells's inspirations for the world set free was an English physicist named Frederick Soddy, who came to prominence for his work in the atomic sciences, specifically for discovering the decay of uranium. Soddy may have the oldest coined quote about nuclear apocalypse, stating in so many words that any man who controlled nuclear power could destroy the Earth if he chose. But Soddy was considered rather whimsical for his predictions, and most physicists of his day thought that nobody could harness such arcane powers, especially not soon. Figures like Ernest Rutherford, who achieved the first artificial transmutation of an atom, likened such notions to drunken ramblings. Things were moving very fast since Marie Curie's discovery of radiation and Einstein's theory of relativity, and even the anatomy of the atom was not understood well enough to consider nuclear power. Seriously, keep this in mind. The neutron, which is a super important part of nuclear fission, was not even discovered until 1932. And spoiler alert, the first atomic explosion occurs in 1945. Also, this is as good a time as any to point those interested to my last video. I decided to make a brief primer on nuclear weapons, how they function, and what some of their most drastic effects are. I will try to provide brief explanations for some of the more technical points I discuss here, but if any of you would like to know more, go check out that video. Anyway, all of this is to say that most physicists recognize the potential power in the atom, but very few chose to pursue the research required to unlock that power. And even when things started to speed up during the 30s and 40s, many scientists, particularly in Nazi Germany, thankfully, thought that the fission reaction required would spiral out of control and destroy the atmosphere. Some thought a fission explosion was impossible, others prohibitively tedious. All were proven wrong by Trinity. July 16, 1945, Los Alamos, New Mexico, the United States of America. 6 kilograms of plutonium is subjected to intense explosive force, causing a devastating fission reaction. Only 15% of the plutonium actually fissions, but the resulting blast generates energy equivalent to 25,000 tons of TNT. Under the leadership of Robert Oppenheimer and U.S. Army General Leslie Groves, the world had been violently ushered into the atomic age. An international coalition of scientists came together to reach this insanely ambitious goal. Many of them, like Leo Szilard, were motivated by an almost panicked anxiety to harness the atom before Nazi Germany. He may not have thought it would have ended the world way back in 1933, but he damn well thought it could win the war for whoever utilized the bomb first. His famous 1939 letter to President Roosevelt outlines the potentiality of specifically ship-borne nukes to destroy port cities.
Is that all?
If that sounds a little underwhelming to you, then you're not alone. In fact, this lack of intensity inherent in the letter nearly sunk the Manhattan Project before it began. But thanks to the studious lobbying of Szilard and Andrew Sachs and a shiny signature from Albert Einstein, the letter did the trick. A mere 6 years later, the atomic bomb was born. Oppenheimer himself only considered the gravity of what he had facilitated after it was too late to walk away. Standing in front of the first nuclear blast, so many of the scientists were just thrilled to have succeeded. They had done their part. The rest was up to politicians and generals. On August 6, 1945, the second atomic explosion occurred. Not over a barren desert in New Mexico, but over a hospital situated right in the middle of Hiroshima, Japan, home to approximately 255,000 subjects of the Empire of the Rising Sun. By the time the dust had settled and the final tally was counted, more than half of that population would be dead. Three days later, the Imperial Japanese city of Nagasaki would be similarly targeted, killing a further 80,000 people. The utter shock and efficient brutality of the attacks pushed the already floundering Japanese to finally surrender. After 3 detonations, the atomic bomb had not ended the world, but it had ended a world war.
I knew the world would not be the same. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Atomic power, atomic power.
Now the question of the potential power of the atom was no longer an esoteric hypothesis amongst physicists. It was now a frightening, terrible, and yet altogether exciting reality for every person on Earth who owned a radio or read a newspaper in 1945. A mixture of relief and pride for the end of the war obfuscated some of the scarier implications of the nuclear bomb in those early days. But those in the know became starkly aware of the horror that had been unleashed. What they knew but were not yet willing to say was that nuclear weapons were far more than just big booms. In the wake of an atomic explosion, a poisonous cloud of particulate matter sweeps over the blast area and beyond, causing sickness and death for any that go through it. Two events helped bring the horror of radiation into focus, one for the US government, the other for the English-speaking world. The first was the Baker Blast from Operation Crossroads. I have an entire video on the subject for anyone interested, but to make a long story short, the Baker Blast was an underwater shot taken to test the resilience of naval ships against nuclear weapons. What it revealed was that even if a ship could resist the blast and thermal effects of the bomb, its crew would be utterly destroyed by radiation poisoning in mere days. I will go over the why of it all in the third video in this series, but suffice it to say, Baker scared the crap out of the surveyors who understood the implications of a nuclear detonation in, say, the Hudson River.
Hey guys, I'm in New York City just hanging out.
This information was strictly guarded by the Truman administration, who feared a public panic in the wake of such a revelation. The second event, however, could not have been contained by the US government, as it did not come from an official report, but from a journalist. John Hersey released a piece simply called Hiroshima in August of 1946. Published in the New Yorker, Hersey's piece featured interviews from the actual victims of the first atomic attack, a group called Hibakusha in Japan. Their stories are harrowing and absolutely terrifying, and the subsequent book released from this piece is a work that I sincerely believe everybody should read. It is difficult and upsetting, but that's because it should be. Seriously, everyone should read Hiroshima and understand what is at risk when the nuclear option is considered. Hersey's piece certainly had an effect when it came out in 1946. Now, people were wise to the terrible effects of nuclear weapons in a way that had not been reported before. That apocalypse that Frederick Soddy had warned of now seemed that much more plausible.
The world's greatest minds in science, statecraft, and military matters are wrestling with the problems created by the atom. On this spot, outlined in stone, is a figure representing the average man, regardless of his race or creed. These atomic footprints on the sands of time can never be erased. They point a path which leads to unparalleled progress or unparalleled destruction.
Then came the 1950s. Just before the dawning of this decade, the Russians defied all expectation and detonated their first nuclear bomb, roughly the 10th nuclear detonation to occur on our planet. The arms race had officially begun, and both powers would spend the next 10 years and beyond building as many nuclear weapons as they could, along with a diverse range of delivery systems. Still though, many during the early 50s did not see nuclear weapons as a true existential threat, with the US government even sponsoring educational content designed to prepare Americans to ride out a Russian attack. Sure, everyone knew it would be bad, but nothing we couldn't handle with a little ingenuity and know-how. But all of that would start to change on November 1st, 1952. On the lonely island of Eniwetok, about 190 miles away from Bikini Atoll, Manhattan Project scientist Edward Teller's vision of the super became a reality with the detonation of Ivy Mike. The bombs that killed so many Japanese people just 7 years earlier had been measured in the kiloton range, but Ivy Mike was a new kind of weapon, the hydrogen bomb, and its power was measured in megatons, 10.4 megatons to be exact. At the time, it took a device the size of a building to deliver such an explosion, but nobody in the atomic physics field had any doubts about their ability to create a deliverable H-bomb. And just 2 short years later, the first mass-produced hydrogen bomb entered American service under the designation Mark 17. Now the world had a real problem. By this point, several big brains from the Manhattan Project expressed their regret for their part in the creation of atomic bombs. And even more warned that the advent of thermonuclear weapons represented a reckless leap toward the apocalypse. Robert Oppenheimer was even dragged into a scandalous investigation that questioned his loyalty in part due to his vehement opposition to the H-bomb. Even before Ivy Mike, Manhattan Project scientists, joined once again by the big man himself, Albert Einstein, came together to educate the world on the implications of atomic weapons. What became of this effort was the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, now perhaps best known for their doomsday clock. The doomsday clock is a metaphorical device meant to measure how close the world is to nuclear apocalypse. The closer the hands of the clock get to striking midnight, the nearer the world is to nuclear devastation. For reference, the furthest the clock has ever been from midnight was 17 minutes in 1991, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the sweeping arms reductions that followed. When it was first conceived of in 1947, the clock read 7 minutes to midnight. But in 1953, after the Soviet Union tested its first thermonuclear-capable device, the bulletin set the doomsday clock to 2 minutes to midnight. A quick aside, the doomsday clock has a lot of clout, and when it was first conceived of, I think it was a well-needed wake-up call for people who weren't taking nuclear weapons seriously. But these days, I'm not so sure it's quite so effective. Just to illustrate this, the clock is actually set right now for 80 seconds to midnight. But the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists now adds things like climate change, biological threats, and even AI to consideration when it moves the hands. Though, to be fair, they say the biggest reason for the close proximity is Russia's nuclear threats over Ukraine. I'm going to make a short video about the clock soon, but I just wanted to bring that up for anyone who might be curious. And before we go back to the H-bombs, please don't hear me saying that the current nuclear danger isn't serious. That's the main reason I'm making this new series in the first place. I just think that conflating nuclear threats with, other stuff can really obfuscate the point. Now the world's most renowned scientists were raising the warning flag high, and for the first time, people actually started to believe that the world might end due to nuclear war. The hydrogen bomb was capable of utterly destroying any city in the world, and both powers were making as many of them as they could manage. By the end of the 50s, almost nobody believed that duck and cover would actually work anymore. And with the ubiquity of long-range bombers and intercontinental ballistic missiles in the 1960s, the Kubrickian doomsday device was now in full effect.
The whole point of the doomsday machine is lost. If you keep it a secret, why didn't you tell the world, eh?
Stanley Kubrick's landmark tour de force black comedy Dr. Strangelove came out in 1964, signaling a fitting end to any pretense that nukes were just another weapon for war. And just like Kubrick, audiences could do nothing but laugh at the sheer absurdity of it all. Kubrick became an expert on atomic bombs, largely thanks to Herman Kahn, an early theorist in the field of nuclear strategy, and author of On Thermonuclear War, which was published in 1960. This book was one of the first to really lay the stakes out plainly for all to see, and Kubrick would even borrow the famous doomsday device motif from this book. Just a year later, exiting President Dwight Eisenhower delivered his now infamous military-industrial complex speech. And while the war hero president did not directly address nuclear weapons in his speech, his warning could not have been more pertinent to the subject. Throughout the 50s and early 60s, the military would be scrambling for more nuclear weapons, and nothing short of a miracle could make them give them up. The nukes weren't going anywhere, and World War III would mean the end of the world. At least that's what normal people thought. So, after all of that historical background, some of you are likely wondering when I'm going to get to the point.
Get on with it! Yes, get on with it!
And I promise, I will try to answer the titular question of this video by the end. But to be honest, that question is kind of tough to answer in total. So for now, let's just tackle the super simple version. Could we actually destroy the physical world itself with nukes? The land area of our planet is approximately 57 million square miles. If we suppose that every nuclear weapon in existence is about 500 kilotons, which would be generous, mind you, and we suppose that all 12,000 nuclear weapons in the world were deployed, could we cover every habitable inch of our planet? Well, the blast radius of a 500 kiloton nuke is about a half a mile for total destruction, and roughly 9 miles for a recognizable effect. That is, thermal radiation causing fires and overpressure knocking over weaker buildings. That's about 108,000 square miles total.
Not a chance.
But what about nuclear fallout? Well, the really dangerous stuff occurs about 12 miles downwind of the blast, and the long-term hazard is usually contained in a 190-mile radius. So if we use the bigger number, we're still only getting about 2 million square-ish miles. And do keep in mind, this is being really, really generous because fallout doesn't actually spread in like a big circle, it usually moves downwind. So yeah, saying that many square miles is actually super, super generous. So it looks like we can't actually nuke the whole world. But what about just the places with people? Well, that's still a pretty tall order. It's estimated that humans occupy about 10% of the land area of Earth, so roughly 5.7 million square miles. And again, if we use the super generous huge number that represents the radiation and fallout, we still really couldn't cover all of that area. It's really impressive that we could render nearly half of that area uninhabitable for a while, but no, we could not actually destroy the known world entirely with nukes. Now, to be sure, I'm not saying the fallout wouldn't be a problem, and early on in nuclear war theory, there was a real fear that the whole world would become irradiated. But since the 70s, that fear has been alleviated somewhat. Though the radiation problem would be truly catastrophic, it would likely only be so regionally.
Nice.
So radiation and kinetic energy is a no, but could you wreck the atmosphere with nukes? Maybe, but probably not. The few times we've done it, it only resulted in big bands of radiation surrounding the Earth, but it didn't really seem to affect our atmosphere all that much. I suppose it could if everybody actually pointed their nukes to the sky and just blew them all up there, but you know, our atmosphere is actually pretty good at dealing with radiation, and I feel like nobody's actually gonna just shoot all their nukes into the sky.
Why not, you stupid bastard?
Honestly, it does not seem that anyone has done any serious research on that subject. Could you dig down to the core of the Earth and blow it up, Dr. Evil style? No, you could not. Again, nobody's actually done any serious research on this, but the core of the Earth is really big and really hot, and we can't even actually get to it, and even if we could, dropping a nuke on it would probably just disintegrate the nuke instantly, so no, that's not going to work either. So it looks like the answer to the question physically is no, you cannot destroy the world with nukes. Case closed. Or is it? Now, the preceding 8th grade math might be enlightening to those with only peripheral knowledge of nuclear weapons, but the hardcore among you are likely rolling your eyes at all of those silly hypotheticals. And that's because most people who fear nuclear apocalypse are not concerned that the whole Earth would be carpeted with nukes. The fear is found in 3 principal places. Firstly, there's the radiation hazard, which I mentioned before. Secondly, there is the fear of environmental change, but we'll get into that a little later. And thirdly, the final point is what we'll be discussing here in part 2, the destruction of the world order. That is, international society at large. In my first World War III video, I talked about the US military's plan to use so-called tactical nuclear weapons in its potential ground war with Russia. I attempted to use the lunacy of these ideas to paint a picture of uncaring military and political leaders who were unwilling to concede that nuclear war could not truly be won. Likewise, I discussed the similar notion on the Soviet side, with their now somewhat famous internal resistance to the mutually assured destruction dogma.
I do not come here to lose.
Despite the warnings of scientists and the very real anxiety of the common man, world leaders have just never seemed to accept the whole nuclear apocalypse idea.
No big deal.
Now, this is not meant to be a sweeping statement, to be sure, but there always seems to be at least one nuclear power that is not afraid to use their weapons as a way to influence policy. It was far more common in the Cold War than it is now, but certain countries in, Asia really seem to jump to the nuclear conclusion pretty readily in their rhetoric. Is this all a bluff? Or maybe they know something we don't. Western leaders always seem pretty certain that a nuclear war cannot be won, but maybe they could be wrong, or maybe they could believe something else behind the scenes. All of these questions are not possible to resolve surely without actually going all the way, so I pray we never get to know those answers. However, I will attempt to describe the worldwide implications of a modern nuclear war here. Please note, everything I'm about to say is highly speculative, and not just on my part. Anybody who thinks they can predict such events to the finest detail is probably trying to sell you something. And all I'm personally trying to do is apply the knowledge I have gained over years of studying to this terrible question. Let us all hope I am never proven right or wrong on any of it. There are a variety of different ways in which a nuclear war could break out today, with possibilities ranging from upscaling of kinetic wars and nuclear responses to surprise invasions, to decapitation strikes brought on by diplomatic failures, or even North Korean out-of-the-blue ICBMs. And yes, I will talk about that in the next video. I will not try to speculate on the most likely scenario today, though I think these days it's pretty easy to guess what that might be, because in the end, the result is always the same.
Well, to be perfectly frank, it's bad.
Back in the Cold War, the US would run war games to prepare for potential war with the commies. My second World War III video revolves around Able Archer 83, a paper war game that simulated a nuclear attack drill in the outbreak of war with Russia. Tests like Able Archer happened throughout the Cold War, and nearly all of them spiraled into all-out nuclear conflict before long. Both sides made it very clear that nuclear attacks would always be met with nuclear responses. So if one side thought they could get away with popping off a TAC nuke in the Fulda Gap, they might just get a few thousand hydrogen bombs in return. But how did we get to that point? And why is it treated like an inevitable outcome that nuclear war will always go all the way? Well, the subject of nuclear strategy is broad and complex, but also narrow and chillingly simple. The complexity derives more from the implications of the simplicity.
I don't understand.
By which I mean to say, after a lot of thinking on how nukes could be used outside of ending the world, nearly everyone agreed that they just couldn't. To put it more clearly, because of the nature of nuclear weapons and the massive advantages they provide, the only reasonable retaliation if one is used is to go for the kill before more get used. This deadly trap is described by Herman Kahn as the escalation ladder. The escalation ladder is a metaphorical device that outlines the way a simple conflict between states may turn into a conventional war, and how that conventional war might turn into a nuclear war. Kahn argued that once the nuclear threshold is crossed, the strategic barriers to escalation decrease significantly.
Tactical nuke incoming! You can stop.
Now, obviously, it is in every country's best interest to avoid being nuked en masse, and as such, the US and USSR tried to avoid escalation as much as they could. The handful of times that tactical nukes were considered, mainly by the US, the risk of escalation was deemed too great for the potential tactical advantages. For example, vaporizing a Vietnamese guerrilla army marching through Laos wasn't seen as expedient if it made Russia more likely to drop world enders on Europe and America. And even though we would be unable to deliver the same outrageous quantity of nukes today as we could have back then, the policy across the globe seems much the same. Of the three largest nuclear powers, only China officially maintains a no first use policy, with Russia and the US reserving the right to use nukes in response to major conventional attacks. And let's be honest, China probably would too if they felt like they were forced to.
Oh, bother.
This means that if, say, just for argument, and totally not a real thing that could happen, just suppose that maybe NATO decides to take a regional conflict to the next level by marching into Russia, then, in this theoretical example that's totally not real, Russia has basically all but promised to use nukes to repel such a proposed incursion, theoretically. To be fair, I already threw up the disclaimer that such threats could always be bluffs, but suffice it to say, it seems reasonable that the thing most likely to beget a nuclear war would be a conventional war. After all, this is the reason the Cold War stayed cold. It became obvious very quickly that simply launching a nuclear attack was a great way to turn your own country into a sheet of glass. But after the war games of the mid-century, it became clear that any kinetic attack between nuclear powers could, and almost always would, end up with an atomic exchange.
The term massive retaliation, as it was understood at the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s, was a policy of responding to major Soviet conventional attacks, for example, in Western Europe, should that have occurred, with a massive nuclear response.
And it might go something like this. Country A is minding its own business when Country B marches 100,000 soldiers into their territory. Country A's defense force is routed, and instead of surrendering, they exercise their nuclear option and drop a 15-kiloton TAC nuke on Country B's main battle group. This prompts Country B, or C for that matter, to respond with TAC nukes of its own.
Let's nuke the bastards.
At this point, most analysts will tell you that it was over when the first nuke went off, and that could be true. Diplomacy would be in really deep shit, to put it bluntly, and ire and rage would be building in Country B to such a point that it would be very unlikely to talk them off of the nuclear cliff. And this is not even mentioning that Country A would probably not wait for them to make up their minds. Country A would anticipate a response, and might choose to keep the initiative with a decapitating ICBM strike, and Country B might just do the same thing. Now, to be clear, a lot of my personal speculation is based on Cold War scenarios and exercises, and the militaries of all three major nuclear powers still prosecute war games to try and prepare for the worst. But of course, it'd be really stupid to tell the world exactly what your strategy might be, so it's kinda hard to say what the specific scenario would look like today. So, is it possible a conventional conflict between the US and Russia might be resolved without nukes? Well, sure. All three powers maintain diplomatic relations with each other, so it is always possible that we could just talk it out. But it is probably unlikely, given the nature of nuclear warfare and the results of the war games of the 20th century. If that first nuke goes off, more will almost certainly follow. However the war starts, the first move in taking out an entire country is pretty obvious. The whole world runs on electricity, with the jolty juice providing everything from infrastructure to military intelligence. If you flip the switch, the entire world will necessarily stop in its tracks, at least for a while. And that's exactly what happens in the wake of a high-altitude electromagnetic pulse. One nuclear weapon detonated high above any given country will fill the air with charged particles and overload electrical systems on a dramatic scale. Any circuit that is not specifically hardened against EMP will shut down and cease functioning for days, or even weeks, depending on how long repairs might take. The reason for this opening move is obvious. It prevents quick civil response, and will slow down military response, rendering any anti-ballistic missile system impotent, if not already hardened. The disasters at Hiroshima and Nagasaki were terrible enough, but just imagine if no functioning rescue vehicles were able to render aid, and nobody in the country could communicate outside of person-to-person conversations. That means no coordinated disaster responses to the most terrible calamity man can create. It is downright diabolical, but a crippled country is far less able to recover if all the lights are turned off first. Now, finally, the show really begins. During the Cold War, the first missiles would be pointed at the following targets in a general priority order. First, you'd hit the enemy ICBM silos with ground-burst weapons, with the idea being to take out as many of them as you could before they're allowed to launch. Next, you'd aim at military installations of nearly any type, with a particular focus on airfields that can service long-range bombers. Then, you start to pick off civilian government centers and commercial airports, with industrial targets like manufacturing and power plants coming next. And oh yeah, the nation's capital would probably be taken out at the same time as the ICBM silos, provided the aggressor is going for a total destruction, no diplomacy needed strategy. Finally, the most controversial aspect of nuclear war: city targeting. So many of the priority targets mentioned above are nestled in cities and suburbs, so you will necessarily massacre millions of non-combatants already. But because of the relative inaccuracy of older weapons, it was assumed that every major city would be in the crosshairs should a total war break out. And besides, if you're gonna do the job, you might as well do the whole thing while you have the ability.
You're talking about mass murder, General, not war.
Mr. President, I'm not saying we wouldn't get our hair mussed. But I do say no more than 10 to 20 million killed, tops, depending on the breaks.
During the 60s, Strategic Air Command's PSYOP even worked in redundancy strikes on already targeted cities, a tactic called overkill. We had the ordnance to make it happen, and you really have to be sure to exterminate every commie to prevent them from propagating again.
Overkill protocols authorized.
But all of those black and white guys were just stupid warmongers, right? We're much more smarter now. Surely, we're past all of that craziness in the 2020s. Well, to be sure, most nuclear payloads have gotten much smaller, and the international arsenal is vastly reduced from Cold War levels. But make no mistake, we definitely still have the capacity to wreck every major city in the world. There are roughly 1,900 cities in the world with populations above
250,000.
And there are currently about 12,000 nuclear weapons out there amongst the nations. I mentioned in my nuclear weapons primer that 1 megaton was the average size for modern nuclear weapons, but I actually kinda goofed up there.
You stupid idiot!
With the true average being somewhere between 200 and 500 kilotons. The reason for this downsizing has to do with increased targeting accuracy, which precludes the need for the ridiculously massive bombs of the Cold War. Now, instead of strapping a 15 megaton warhead on an R-36, countries like Russia can load up to 15 separate warheads onto a single missile, and send them to each of their own specific targets. This is possible thanks to another Cold War technology known as MIRV, or Multiple Independently Targetable Reentry Vehicle. If you can reliably put your medium to lower yield nukes wherever you want, you preclude the need for apocalypse-class weapons like the mammoth B-41 gravity bomb. And that sounds like good news, right? Well, actually, it doesn't really change much in terms of lethality. It just means that many smaller bombs would be doing the work of one larger bomb. That RS-28 I mentioned earlier carries multiple 300 kiloton warheads at the low end of its capacity. And always remember, dear viewers, that the Hiroshima bomb was a mere 15 kilotons. If all 15 possible warheads on the RS-28 are 300 kiloton bombs, then its capacity for destruction is still orders of magnitude higher than Fat Man or Little Boy. And there are dozens, if not hundreds, of similar weapons across the US and Russia's arsenals, waiting in underground silos, strapped to stealth bombers, or even prowling in the depths of our oceans. And keep in mind, every nuclear power is aware of all of the facts I just laid out, and are likely implementing appropriate plans in their contingencies. Nuclear strategy is a fascinating topic in that it is extremely complex, but also arguably non-existent. A typical war planner tries to mitigate friendly losses while inflicting as few unnecessary losses on their enemies as possible to achieve their goals. But nuclear war is different. You can't just march in and occupy a fallout zone. And even if you could, the valuable parts of your enemy's territory would be destroyed. In addition, and more importantly, your enemy is always going to respond in kind, meaning you wouldn't even survive to reap the rewards. It's not a game of chicken where one side will flinch and not attack. It's more like pushing the shiny red button knowing it will kill you, but finding solace in knowing that your enemy would be dead too. For this reason, and others, a successful counterattack is the most that countries generally hope for these days. The speed of ICBMs and the elusiveness of nuclear-armed submarines means that it has become very difficult to achieve the coveted Alpha Strike.
It's not possible!
In nuclear war parlance, the Alpha Strike is the holy grail. It's the ability of one country to strike first, decapitate leadership, and totally disable retaliatory capabilities. It means you win. It means you took the whole pot and lost nothing. But in a sense, the entirety of the Cold War was waged over prevention of this ability. Things like airborne alert, dead man triggers on ICBMs, sneaky submarines, spy planes, spy satellites, Star Wars, signals intelligence, human intelligence, proxy wars, and even sponsored protests were all done in the interest of preventing an Alpha Strike. Whether or not either side was or wasn't hoping to achieve an Alpha Strike, both sides knew that by the early 60s, it basically wasn't possible.
Nobody wins in nuclear war, because both sides are sure to suffer terrible damage.
But is it possible today? Well, it's hard to say for sure, but I'm going to go over that question more in part 2. For now, let it suffice to say, probably not. Even if you give credence to the constant speculation that Cold War-aged weapons wouldn't work today, if even half of the world arsenal does work, there would be more than enough for both sides to kill each other. Technology has gotten better, but there hasn't been a one-sided leap in the arms race as of yet. Russia is currently flexing its hypersonic glide vehicle muscle pretty obnoxiously, but fancy toys can't protect them from retaliation, and they know it. If I had to guess, I would think that they're trying to show it off so much because they want to warn the world that they can't be decapitated, that you can't defend against their response. To this day, that same stalemate lives on, so anybody hoping for an Alpha Strike from whichever side is likely hoping in vain. So by now, I hope it is quite obvious that Russia, China, and the US could definitely hit every major target in the world if they wanted to, with plenty left over to cover their bases. But would that really mean the end of the world? How destructive would that actually be? It's time for some depressing math. What would happen if all the nuclear powers decided to blow up every city in the world? My methodology for the following hypothesis is not perfect, nor is it terribly scientific. All I'm trying to do here is paint a picture of what casualty rates might look like in an absolute worst possible case global nuclear war. I had an AI speculate on what the most average cities in the world might be based on population, land area, and median income. It gave me 2 places, Krakow, Poland, and Durban, South Africa. I virtually targeted both cities using NukeMap, then took the average casualties from both to represent a typical 21st century city. If we assume the low end of the average ICBM payload is 300 kilotons, and we assume that of the 12,000 nuclear weapons in the world arsenal, at least 1,900 of them are strapped to ICBMs, IRBMs, and SLBMs, then we get the following casualty average from my targeted cities, based on NukeMap estimates. Across every major city, approximately 514,491,500 people would die, nearly at an instant. But arguably worse than that, the number of injured amounts to 1.18 billion. All of those people would be in desperate need of medical care that would be slow in coming if it arrived at all. Now, these numbers should sound huge and scary to everybody, but some of you may find them a little optimistic. I mean, the world has a population of roughly 8 billion, and we barely hit 500 million deaths. This is supposed to be the end of the world, right? Now, bear in mind, Alex Wellerstein, the creator of NukeMap, calls these numbers evocative more than definitive, and that's because he had to ignore many variables when generating these estimates. His map generally does not take fallout and radiation deaths into consideration, and city makeup can change the way the initial blast affects the area in some pretty drastic ways. Just see Hiroshima versus Nagasaki if you don't believe me. Ultimately, it is impossible to know how many initial casualties might arise in the wake of a global nuclear war, but they would doubtless range in the millions or tens of millions at least. Couple those numbers with the further millions that would die from fallout and from succumbing to injury, and nuclear war will easily eclipse World War II, perhaps by 2 or 3 orders of magnitude. It is even thought that in the wake of such widespread and high dosages of radiation, that succeeding generations in belligerent countries would see a rise of birth defects ranging from the innocuous to the catastrophic. But I will be getting deeper into those weeds in part 2, since, like the environmental effects, the congenital effects would be largely uneven and regional. With all of this said, you might be surprised to hear that my hypothetical destroy all cities scenario is actually overestimating the destruction expected from a US-Russia conflict. And that's because, as awful as our world leaders may or may not be, we can be pretty certain they are not going to nuke every major city in the world just because they can.
You sure about that? You sure about that?
Targeting bias is a real thing, and nobody wants to waste their nukes on places that don't matter in a global war. If you live in the southern hemisphere and your country is not home to bases owned by NATO, Russia, or China, then you probably won't even see a nuclear detonation on your soil. A Princeton study predicted a maximum casualty range of about 90 million dead in the opening act of a nuclear war. And yes, the wounded would suffer grievously from the lack of care, and the fallout would kill even more, but surely humanity would still survive, right? Even without lights and modern comforts, we'd still have enough people to pick up the pieces, wouldn't we? During the mid-20th century, lots of really smart people had already figured out casualty figures and damage ranges that might result from a nuclear conflict. Everyone knew it would be a terrible, titanic catastrophe that would cripple the entire world should it ever happen. Cities would lie in ruins, and tens, even hundreds of millions of people might end up dead. But we would not all die. If one side prepared hard enough and planned smart enough, they could survive the conflict and rebuild on the other side. In the immortal words of former sackhead Tommy Power, at the end of the war, if there are 2 Americans and 1 Russian left alive, we win. Of course, politicians had to deny this mentality in public, and to be sure, I don't imagine any US president or even Soviet premier actually wanted nuclear war. But the militaries of either country must necessarily be concerned with winning wars, or at least surviving them.
Don't worry, I brought my Rappin' Ronnie Reagan tape.
When President Ronald Reagan came into office at the dawn of the 80s, he promised to be tougher on the commies in Russia, and he made good on this promise by pumping the military with cash and expanding the US armed forces more rapidly than ever before in peacetime. Reagan was willing to talk with Premier Andropov, but he also made it very clear that he was willing to go much further if he felt he had to. It seemed that both sides were gearing up for war, with 1983 likely being one of the most dangerous years in recent history. Protests broke out in both countries, and pundits and eggheads were shouting endlessly for a cool down. But there was one man that feared a cool down more than anything else. Sorry. Yes, Carl Sagan was the face of a new theory that promised to whip all of these cold warriors into shape and stop the madness. But he was not the only name attached to the theory of nuclear winter. The idea was first floated back in 1975, but it would come into prominence due to the work of 5 scientists: Richard Turco, Owen Toon, Thomas P. Ackerman, James B. Pollack, and Carl Sagan, collectively known as T-TAPS. The theory, in short, goes like this. During a nuclear war of nearly any scale, cities will be targeted, struck, and subsequently set ablaze by thermal radiation. Every flammable object within a mile of the epicenter will be subjected to temperatures in the thousands of degrees Celsius, and fires will undoubtedly result. Then, as in the attack on Hiroshima, firestorms might form, miles in diameter. These firestorms would continue to burn well after the initial blast, immolating cars, office buildings, houses, and all manner of industrial material, carrying the resulting soot and ash high into the sky. If this effect took place in a few dozen cities, it would result in trillions of grams of black carbon being injected into the high atmosphere. Once there, the nasty pollutants would obscure and absorb the sun's light, possibly for years, causing a global temperature decrease of as much as 8 degrees Celsius. The resulting ice age would cause crop failures, mass starvation, and even meteorological phenomena, depending on who you ask. Now, instead of just a hot conflict affecting hundreds of millions, atomic war might bring about a nuclear winter, causing famines across the globe, affecting literal billions of people. And there you have it, at long last, the end of the world, brought to you by nuclear weapons. Despite some slow going in official and military circles, the theory began to catch on fast among normal folk. This is due in large part to Carl Sagan's contribution, with the Cosmos host being one of the original celebrity scientists. Sagan went on as many TV programs as he could to warn the people of the dangers of nuclear winter, with one pretty meaningful result being 1984's Threads. This British nuclear war drama features an almost direct representation of T-TAP's nuclear winter theory, showing post-apocalypse Britain as a rotten, almost medieval wasteland, filled with starving, sick people. The theory was scary, even horrifying, and it worked, so to speak. While initially Reagan's government just used nuclear winter to push the Star Wars program, which is of infinite amusement to me, eventually, nuclear winter became so ubiquitous that Reagan himself referenced it in a 1985 speech. And while no nuclear power has ever fully recognized the theory, yes, you heard that right, Sagan and the boys sure made it a household name. In fact, I'm almost 100% positive that my viewers know of and likely believe in the theory of nuclear winter. After all, it is the way the world ends if we go too far.
Patrolling the Mojave almost makes you wish for a nuclear winter.
This societal familiarity has turned into a sort of reverence for the theory, a sort of unshakable certainty in its conclusions. And why not? T-TAPs were all smart dudes, and they had computer models that predicted their assertions, sometimes to an even more dire scale than they believed possible. And the theory doesn't stop there, with scientists contributing more research to the idea as the years go by. Despite this wide acceptance, though, there are some who doubt the veracity of the nuclear winter theory. There are a handful of assumptions that must be held tightly if the more apocalyptic result is to be expected, and for some, those assumptions are just too presumptuous to be believed. Before I dip into the naysaying, let's go over the details a bit more so we know what's going on. Two things principally happen during a nuclear war that might drastically affect the climate. First is the creation and subsequent lofting of large amounts of black carbon, and second is the creation of nitrogen oxides from the breakdown of air molecules from the detonation. Black carbon is just a more technical word for soot, which basically refers to incompletely combusted, heavily oxidized carbon. Think like black smoke when you burn rubber or plastic. This soot is lofted high into the stratosphere, so roughly 15 to 20 kilometers into the air, by firestorms. Once there, the soot reflects sunlight and absorbs heat, damaging the atmosphere even more, and causing the Earth to cool. T-TAPs predicted that all that soot would remain in the atmosphere for several years, causing a veritable ice age, which historically have been really tough on squishy mammals like us. The nitrogen oxides are likewise lofted into the atmosphere, but rather by the nuclear explosion itself. This causes further damage to the ozone layer, which would allow harmful ultraviolet rays to bathe the Earth. If both of these nasty effects occur to the levels predicted by nuclear winter theorists, then it would be akin to the worst effects of climate change occurring after a years-long period of global cooling and crop failure.
That wasn't what I wanted. At all.
Obviously, there is a lot more detail involved in the mechanisms of nuclear winter, but that's a pretty basic way of understanding it. Every study I've read gets progressively worse in terms of its apocalyptic predictions, but it is important to remember that all of the newer models still base their simulations on the same set of assumptions T-TAPS put forward back in the 80s. Firstly, we have to assume that almost every city would indeed erupt into a firestorm after detonation. My longest subscribers might remember that my very first video on this channel is all about firestorms, so if you want to know more about them, go check it out and enjoy my on-camera awkwardness. But the TLDR version is this. A firestorm is an intense and self-sustaining fire in which the heat generated creates a powerful updraft that draws in oxygen, intensifying and spreading the blaze across a large area. These conflagrations can loft black carbon well into the stratosphere, where the sun continues to heat the black particles, causing them to rise even further until being trapped. So in some sense, the whole theory is all about firestorms. But any of you that watched my video on the subject will know that firestorms are not that easy to create. They require some pretty specific circumstances to form, and you don't get one just from high heat. If you don't believe me, go check out the Vietnam War section of my video when the US Air Force actually tried to make firestorms. Spoiler alert, they failed. In fact, it would not be unreasonable to assume that modern cities would be less susceptible to firestorm formation than the cities of World War II. The US government has reported that firestorms are not likely to occur in North American cities, even in the wake of a nuclear detonation. The reason for this assumption is that modern cities do not have enough burnable fuel in close proximity to perpetuate a firestorm. To be sure, firestorms have formed at or near cities as recently as 2016, but never in a sprawling metropolis. And yet, the nuclear winter theory puts a lot on the formation of firestorms. Now, I should make it clear that firestorms might more easily form in highly flammable suburbs and almost certainly in dense industrial areas, but one does hope that such places would not be intentionally targeted. Perhaps one vainly hopes. Again, this is all speculative, and hopefully we never learn the answers to these questions. You know the deal. So I do want to do a quick addendum here for everybody to help people understand firestorms a little bit better. First, there's this quick caveat. Yes, it is true that in the wake of a nuclear attack, there would be no emergency vehicles like fire trucks to help put out the fires that might turn into a storm. That is true, and that's probably a good reason why firestorms almost never happen anymore in major cities. But again, there is also the question of, steel, glass, all kinds of different sorts of metal rather than wood that would sort of decrease the likelihood of a firestorm in a city. So I want to make that point clear. You can kind of make of that what you will. I'm not exactly sure how I feel about it. I do think that firestorms would be less likely to form in a major city of today. Next, I did want to mention that there is kind of a precedent here for firestorms not forming in one nuclear explosion and then forming in another. Because at Hiroshima, there was famously a very large firestorm that consumed a large part of the city, but at Nagasaki, there was not. So take that how you will. Again, I'm not trying to make a real decision on the matter here myself. I just want to sort of give you the facts so you can decide for yourself. So hopefully that's helpful. Next, many nuclear winter dissenters point to the past volcanic eruptions in our planet's history, some of which created volcanic winters of their own. In 1815, Mount Tambora erupted, releasing energy equivalent to roughly 30,000 megatons. That's the equivalent of 100,000 of our 300 kiloton bombs from earlier. In addition, it also shot as much as 120 teragrams of ash, soot, and dust into the stratosphere. The blast was so loud that it could be heard from as far as 2,000 miles away from the epicenter, and the volcanic fallout could be felt for 800 miles. Nuclear weapons are no doubt terrifying, but it would seem in this case that nature could not be matched. In the wake of the Tambora eruption, the world experienced a year without a summer, when temperatures dropped by only 0.53 degrees Celsius. Well anyway, 1816 was a chilly one, and many contribute spikes in epidemic diseases to the cold, along with famines and food shortages, particularly in Ireland. The 1810s was one of the chilliest decades on record, too, showing that atmospheric injection truly can alter our climate in a noticeable way. But rather than seeing this example as proof of concept for nuclear winter, many see it as quite the opposite. Tambora was far, far more powerful than any single nuclear weapon, and the entire arsenal of the world cannot come close to that 30,000 megatons. In addition, T-TAPS reckoned that at least 50 teragrams of soot would have to be injected into the atmosphere to cause a nuclear winter. If Tambora threw up 120 and we only got a slight temperature decrease for less than a decade, then how could we expect a nuclear winter to last so long and decrease temperatures so much?
How would we explain all this to a dispassionate extraterrestrial observer?
Shut up, science bitch.
It's a compelling argument, but the nuclear winter theory has answers. Firstly, that 30,000 megatons of energy is not distributed the same way as a nuclear bomb, with most of the energy release being kinetic and concentrated in one place. A big place to be sure, but still just one place. 4,000 megatons spread out over every major NATO and Russian city would arguably represent a much bigger crisis on a global scale. Secondly, nuclear winter proponents argue that sulfur dioxide shot out by volcanoes is lightly colored and more dense than the nasty black carbon soot produced by city fires. This means that while sulfur dioxide falls out relatively quickly, the black carbon will absorb sunlight and loft higher due to heat-induced buoyancy. Because it is so fine and bouncy, modern models even suggest that black carbon from nuclear war can affect global air circulation, causing it to remain even longer. Next, there is the issue of computer modeling. The computers used to model the original nuclear war theory are archaic by today's standards, but newer models seem to be producing the same results. Though in all of the studies I read, it seems that the authors were working off of the same basic climate models as before, with a lot of assumptions on the thresholds of atmospheric loading, and of course, assuming that firestorms will be super prevalent. I have to mention them again here because the estimated 12 or so teragrams of black carbon we produce yearly does not seem to have the same nuclear winter effect. One of the reasons is because firestorms superheat the carbon and cause it to loft higher and in tighter concentration. Seriously, it is hard to understate the importance of firestorms to the theory of nuclear winter. In the end, though, it is difficult to argue that nuclear war would have no effect on our climate. And it is worth mentioning that I could not find a single peer-reviewed study from the past 20 years that seeks to refute nuclear winter. But is that just because the science is so strong, or could it be something more? Documentarian Neil Halloran has a very interesting video on the controversy around nuclear winter, in which he approaches the subject as a former believer. He does a good job of exploring the flaws in the argument, but more importantly, he discusses why he felt reticent to make his video in the first place.
Is that after learning that I may have overstated the nuclear winter threat, I didn't feel motivated to set the record straight. Like, what's the benefit of pursuing truth in a case like this, when the takeaway is confusing? Is the truth reason enough?
Whether nuclear winter would certainly happen or not, it has had the effect of making people fear nuclear war as an existential threat to the entire human race. If it makes people think twice about pulling the nuclear lever, then why should anyone quibble or poke holes in the argument? In The World Set Free, the French ambassador Leblanc gazes upon the destruction of the world, lit up by perpetual nuclear fires. This naive statesman is filled with virtue and humility. He summons the leaders of the world together, imparting his indefatigable humanity onto them, compelling even the King of England to abdicate in favor of a utopian, one-world government. The world follows this example, and soon the atom is turned into a source of humanitarian power, precluding the need for even work as we know it. It's a Wellesian paradise where the most common profession is that of the artist, and where even love is superseded by the all-important pursuit of knowledge. In Wells's story, knowledge almost destroys the world, but ultimately, it sets the world free. The real answer to the question of this video, that terrible and yet so obscure a question, can the world survive a nuclear war, is, of course, yes. Even the most pessimistic predictions of nuclear winter did not assume that all humanity would die, at least not soon. But ultimately, it likely won't matter if we survive or not. Even H.G. Wells could not have conjured up the terrible destructive power of modern nuclear weapons, or the debilitating terror of EMP. In addition, Wells lived in a time when the globe was far less connected and when most countries were relatively self-sustaining. If Europe, China, and the United States were all heavily bombed in a nuclear war, global trade would come to an almost complete stop. Food shortages would be widespread and deadly, and infrastructures across the entire globe would be shattered. Even the haggard number left to rebuild would have to struggle against starvation and radiation sickness, having to avoid massive swaths of land due to contamination. Our world is more connected than ever, and for many people, that means comforts and luxuries undreamed of, even in Wells's time. Everything from food and clothing to high-tech commodities and microchips are circulated around the globe via trade. Even in the case of a conventional World War III, everyone will suffer due to the ceasing of global import and export. Port cities would be crippled indefinitely, and air travel would be all but impossible due to the targeting of major airports. In part 2 of this series, I'll get into the dangers that specifically the US faces in being an import economy, but suffice it to say, a nuclear conflict would shatter all trade and communication across the world, perhaps irreparably so. Wells imagined that despite the terrible destruction, our world leaders could set aside their differences and lead the world into technological paradise. But in a worst-case nuclear war scenario, it is unlikely our world leaders would even be alive to lead us. Communities, even countries, would likely try to rally and stay together, and perhaps some would find success. But the time of global politics would be ended. Global nuclear war would not end the world, but it almost certainly would end the current world order. I researched the theory of nuclear winter extensively for this video, poring over a dozen different peer-reviewed studies and several books, including the T-TAPS book. I certainly have my own opinions on the theory's strength, but I hesitate to say what those opinions are. And no, it's not because I think any of my viewers will start pulling for a nuclear war if I say one thing or another. But rather, it's because I just don't think it makes a difference. Over the course of my research, what I can be absolutely certain of is this. Nuclear weapons are the most destructive man-made inventions ever created. They produce heat, blast, and radiation to such a level as to decimate any city in the world. The 2 times they were used resulted in massive instant death and the total destruction of their targets. World War I was the costliest modern conflict to date when it happened, and World War II was the most costly conflict bar none. With nuclear weapons in play, it is an absolute certainty that World War III would kill many, many more people than its predecessors. Will the world end? No. Will humanity end? Probably not. But I think it goes without saying that the world would be a very different place after the dust settles. Even if one ignores the possibility of nuclear winter, it is not unreasonable to assume that all but the most remote communities will be affected by World War III. Depending on the belligerents and how hard they choose to go with their nukes, certain places will be affected more than others. But what about your country? How would a war between the nuclear powers affect where you live? Well, if you want to know the answer and you happen to live in the US like me, then you're in luck. Part 2 of this series will zoom in just a bit more and try to answer the question, could the USA survive a nuclear war? I'm going to talk about our missile defenses, offensive capability, and what civil defenses we may or may not have. Now that we have established that the world will survive, surely sweet America will rise like a phoenix from the nuclear ashes, right? Tune in to find out. Alright everybody, thank you so much for watching what is likely going to be the longest video I've ever made, both in terms of length and how long it took me to freaking produce it. I'm so sorry, it's been 6 months since I've released a video, and if you can believe it, I've actually been working on this video for far longer than even that. It's been a mammoth project. I know it probably seems like it was so overly broad that I could have just made this video at any time, but since I talked about a lot of really theoretical scientific stuff, both from like a military science perspective and from environmental science, I wanted to make sure that I was, crossing all of my T's, dotting my I's, and giving you guys as much information as possible to sort of think about that question, would the world survive? My answer, of course, is yes. I think that's probably going to be the answer for most people. Of course, the Herman Kahn question of will the living envy the dead? That's always going to be a big part of all of this. But I hope that I have answered that question to all of your satisfaction. So now, just some quick upkeeping stuff that I want to talk about for the future of the channel. I am now monetizable. I hit 1,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is, you know, it's astounding to have reached that milestone. It's been a long 3 years, starting from nothing and getting up to 1,000. Of course, monetization doesn't mean a whole lot right now because everything is kind of slow. But I'm hoping to speed things up a little bit with some more frequent video production, doing some more kind of casual ideas that I've got floating around, along with trying to intersperse like Doom to Rewind and some smaller videos. I mentioned the Doomsday Clock one that I'm going to do. That's going to be probably like 10 to 15 minutes rather than my normal 20 to 30 minutes. So that's exciting. I've also decided that I do want to try to create a Patreon. It'll probably be pretty sparse as far as like what the rewards are for right now, but I figured I'd put it out there. If any of you guys like what I do and you want me to continue to do more, that's going to be a great way to kind of ensure that more stuff is going to come out. So last thing I want to say here is some really exciting news. My wife is pregnant again. We're having a son. He's going to be born in October. So at the end of the year, things are probably going to slow down a little bit. I'm going to try to produce ahead of myself so that I can release while we're in that first 2 months where we're kind of up all night with him. But anyway, yeah, so that's really exciting news. So we're going to be a little family of 4 here very soon. Yeah, so we'll be like the family on the Protect and Survive videos. So that's going to be great. That's what I've always wanted to be. You know, protect and survive. Anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. And at this point, I feel like I have to say thanks a lot. Bye. So like, subscribe. Thanks a lot. Bye.